It is this proof of concept that if you feed people carbs to the level that they oxidize, or you overfeed them with carbs, you're not going to oxidize more, suggesting that the amount that you're shoving in isn't, in this case, the limiting factor here. Something else is the limiting factor.
Welcome back to Fuel In. I'm your host, Scott Tyndall, and once again, I'm joined by Dr. Alan McCubbin. Alan, how are you doing?
Pretty good. It's winter here in Australia. I know you're sort of half rugged up and not half rugged up. I've got a nice
I've got the beanie
room,
on.
But it's certainly a lot colder outside than it seems looking at the video.
Yeah, well, the sun's shining, so we can't complain. I heard someone saying, oh, it's so cold. Someone was complaining about the weather, and then someone told them to shut up and said, it's not that bad. You just put a jumper on or a beanie. So, we can't complain. And, I'm looking forward to this session. I can't remember if we decided to call our little segment of Fuel In sessions. I like 2 scoops of science, although we're only discussing 1 scoop of science today in relation to one particular study, although I think the second scoop is probably what it means to athletes. And so I think that's a really nice way of sort of segueing into this study. And the study we're going to talk about today is titled Personalized Carbohydrate Feeding During Exercise Based on Exogenous Glucose Oxidation, a Proof of Concept Study. The authors on this was Tim Podlicker, Natasha Cooper-Smith, Javier Gonzalez, and Gareth Wallace, all based in the UK. This study, I don't know, well, it probably caused some sort of shockwaves in our circle, probably not global, but it was certainly an interesting study, and I think the proof of concept study part of the title was really important. But why don't we just get into it? And look, I guess, where do we want to start? Do we want to start with like sort of the top 3 takeaways that we got from it, or do we want to start with like actually what was being studied?
We'll start off with what was being studied. We can come back to takeaways. I think there's a couple of things that we need to kind of define here in terms of terms to make it all make sense, I suppose.
Yeah, okay. So why don't we start there? So what was actually studied in this?
Yeah, so the study looked at basically whether you could measure the amount of what we call exogenous carbohydrate oxidation. What that basically means is carbohydrate oxidation is using carbohydrate as a fuel source, turning it into energy. So we can get that carbohydrate from what we call endogenous stores. So this is carbohydrate that's already in the body when the exercise starts. So this is our muscle glycogen stores. Our liver glycogen is a little bit which tops up our blood glucose, and that can travel to the muscles as well. So that's our endogenous carbohydrate stores. And then exogenous carbohydrate is the carbohydrate that comes into the body during the exercise itself. So exogenous from outside the body. So this is the carbohydrate in our drinks, our gels, our bars, chews, whatever it is that we're consuming during the exercise itself. So you might wonder, well, why do we care whether it's exogenous or endogenous? But it gives us some insights into, I guess, the journey that the carbohydrate takes from the food that we put in our mouth all the way through the gut, absorbed into the blood, and then making it to the muscle and getting used for energy. But it also has, I guess people have kind of hypothesized over the years that it has implications for how much of those glycogen stores you're using up during exercise, and the implications that might have in endurance sports later on when you have to put the hammer down towards the end of an event to burn off your competitor, or there's a hill climb at the finish, or whatever it is, that you theoretically want that carbohydrate to be available. So I guess one of the holy grails that people have been chasing over decades now is this kind of glycogen sparing, which is people have looked at trying to increase the body's ability to use fat to save glycogen. People have looked, and that didn't really work out, because as you improved fat oxidation, you impaired the ability to use carbohydrates, or even if you spared it, you couldn't really use it that effectively. And then there's the exogenous, taking in more and more and more, and that's the trend we're seeing at the moment in endurance sports, is taking in more and more carbohydrate to, have more carbohydrate available to the body, to use that in the muscle, and then theoretically, the hypothesis is to then spare the glycogen that's stored the endogenous carbohydrate. As we'll see, it doesn't always work out that way. So that's what exogenous carbohydrate oxidation means. And I guess studying it is quite difficult and very expensive to study because you have to use what's called a stable isotope tracer. Basically, the carbohydrate you give them, the carbon in the carbohydrate has to be labeled with what we call a specific isotope. It's carbon 13 in this case because most of the carbon in our bodies is carbon 12. And by doing that, they can measure through breath samples how much of the carbon in the carbon dioxide that's coming out as we're breathing out during exercise is carbon 12 versus 13, and using some clever lab techniques, you can analyze that and basically work out how much of the carbohydrate being burnt during exercise is coming from the exogenous carbohydrate versus the glycogen, the endogenous stores.
Perfect. So I think what we now understand is the difference between endogenous and exogenous carbohydrates and why that's important to the overall sort of what they studied in here, and then how they actually went about studying the exogenous carbohydrate oxidation versus, say, total carbohydrate oxidation, and working out those endogenous stores. So if we look at who was studied in this, who did they use and how many?
So they had 11 participants in this study, 6 females, 5 males. Overall, if we look at, I guess, their level of fitness, there was some criteria around this that the males had to have a VO2 max of at least 55 mils per kilo per minute, and the women more than 50. On average, the males are about 65, so it's fairly high level without being professional or world class. And the females 54, and the combined average was 59, which is probably higher than the average typical study you get in sort of endurance-related sports nutrition research. Is probably more around the 50 to 55 mark. So the fact that this is nudging 60 with both females and males combined is pretty impressive compared to a lot of studies that you see.
Yeah, I thought it was. I certainly hadn't seen this regularly in any of the research I've read of late, so I thought that was an interesting point. They had 6 females and 5 males as well, which was nice. So there was definitely that inclusion of female to see how carbohydrates and how they utilize those. What else went on?
So what they were essentially trying to do here is look at measuring people's exogenous oxidation of carbohydrate. So they fed them carbohydrate with this stable isotope, and then they measured how much of that they utilized. So they deliberately overfed them, and we've talked about this, I think, on a previous podcast, that you deliberately overfeed them to see how much of that they can oxidize, because if you only give them, let's say, 70 grams an hour, and they oxidize all of it, then the question is, well, could they have oxidized more if we just fed them more? And so you don't want to be in that situation where, the amount that you fed is kind of the limiting factor. You want to look at what else is the limiting factor. So they deliberately overfed them, and you might say 90 grams an hour, that's not much, but this was 90 grams an hour purely of glucose. So normally when we recommend carbohydrate at these higher intake levels, it's a combination of glucose and fructose. So all the carbs that we eat will digest down into 3 basic sugars: glucose, fructose, and galactose. Glucose and galactose are absorbed through the same channel in the gut, so you really only need one, and glucose is the predominant one. And fructose is absorbed separately, so you can add those two together and get more carbohydrate absorbed. But in this particular study, they were just looking at the glucose component. And at 90 grams an hour is generally considered more than people can actually take up and use during exercise from an exogenous oxidation point of view. So they gave them.
I'd imagine on that, Al, I imagine a lot of people looked at this and went, well, why did they only use glucose only? Like, a lot of people, when they first saw this study, I think, were like, well, why wouldn't you use the multiple sort of the glucose and fructose? And do we want to sort of, I mean, you've sort of explained it there that you're purposely overfeeding them on the amount of carbohydrate, in particular glucose, that they could possibly oxidize. So we know that. Is that the prime reason why they did that and didn't go down the route of glucose, fructose, because they wouldn't know what that upper limit would be as a proof of concept?
Yeah, possibly. That they don't. Yeah, I mean, that's possibly it, that they don't know what that upper limit for fructose in, because it's probably a lot more variable than it is for glucose as far as we know. to date. I think the other reason is cost and just the technical requirements of the study. So people have no idea how much this stuff actually costs, and someone has to pay for it at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And I suspect cost was another reason why they went for only glucose and not fructose as well. So it's not like stable isotopes is certainly not my area of expertise, but from my limited understanding, I think that's probably the two main reasons. Yeah.
Yeah, and I know we're going to talk about some of the limitations of the study or things that maybe could be done in the future from a real world perspective. So we'll park that little bit and we'll just put it in reserve for the time being. So let's keep going. So what I think you did cover exactly. Yeah, they fed them 90 grams an hour of glucose only to the group as a baseline, didn't they? And what did that in terms of the study design? Right. Was there anything else that was worth noting in terms of the study design?
Yeah, so it was a cycling-based study. So they rode for 3 hours on the bike. Oh, sorry, no, 2.5 hours on the bike.
Yep.
They did that at 95% of their first lactate threshold. So some people may not be familiar. There's actually two different lactate thresholds. The first lactate threshold is probably around the middle of zone 2 in most zone models. Obviously, they're different models. Probably, a bit below kind of your typical Ironman power output on the bike if you're thinking from a triathlon point of view, if you're going to sort of peg it to, I guess, a real world scenario. As we said before, these were not professional, but fairly fit athletes. So for the male participants, their average was 217 watts at that 95% of first lactate threshold. And for the females, it was 157 watts. The direct data wasn't reported on this, but from putting the bits and pieces together, it looks about 70 to 75% of their calories were being produced from carbohydrate and about 25 to 30% from fat at that intensity, which is pretty much what you would expect at that intensity when you are feeding lots of carbohydrate. Obviously, if you withheld the carbohydrate, that mix would start to change. But yeah, they rode 2.5 hours at that intensity, and then they would measure the total amount of carbohydrate and fat that they oxidize, putting a mask on, same as you do in a VO2 max test. You can measure carbohydrate versus fat utilization. And then from the breath samples of that carbon dioxide, you can work out how much of that carbohydrate that's being used is the exogenous versus the endogenous carbohydrate. And essentially what they were trying to do by doing this protocol with the 90 grams an hour of glucose is to try and work out, well, how much of that glucose, of that 90 grams per hour, did they actually turn into energy? So was exogenously oxidized, essentially. And so that was the first part of the study. The second part is they brought them back again and did the same exercise protocol, but what they did this time is they reduced the dose of carbohydrate to 20% above what their peak, the highest exogenous oxidation rate was in the original trial. Now, the reason they go 20% above that is because in any of these studies, when you feed carbohydrate, you don't oxidize 100% of what you put in your mouth. Typically, it's around 80%, hence why they went 20% above that, assuming that your 80% of what they fed would be oxidized. And what they were looking at basically is to see, okay, well, if we reduce the carbohydrate down to the level that individual actually uses, does that start to reduce, or will they maintain the same rate of oxidation even though we've fed them less carbs? So that's essentially what they're trying to determine in the study.
Okay, so effectively they've done this baseline testing. They worked out 90 grams an hour, and then they've assessed their exogenous oxidation rates. And then what they've done is a trial of personalized carbohydrate intake. And what sort of amounts of carbohydrates did they start to feed based on the personalized recommendations, based on this exogenous oxidation rates that they saw?
Yeah, so it was a little bit different from person to person, which is what you would expect. And we'll talk about maybe the reasons for some of those differences shortly. But for some people, it was almost half, and some people it was only a little bit less. So the average intakes, remember they did 90 grams an hour in the first trial, and then they dropped it down to 20% above what they actually oxidized in that trial. So in the second trial, the average was 65 grams an hour. So it's a reduction of almost a third, but it was quite variable. So as I said, as low as 49 grams an hour in some people. In other words, they were oxidizing even less than that, up to 80 grams an hour. In other words, they oxidized the majority of that 90 grams that they were taking in the first trial. So that's kind of the range that they had. And then obviously they then measured the oxidation again to see what the oxidation rate would be feeding this lower amount, but theoretically above what they were capable of oxidizing.
Al, just on that, so the rates, the carbohydrate oxidation rates that they saw per minute were actually grams per minute were actually fairly low compared to what we've seen in other studies.
Not slightly low, but not
Slightly
massively.
lower.
Yeah.
Do
Yeah.
you? My only question is, when you look at the watts that they were performing in, and given their VO2 max was actually very high, do we think the power that they were pushing was it high enough to stimulate like maximal like oxidation rates at that level?
Yeah, it's a good question. I was in contact with Tim Podlegar over the weekend just gone, actually, about something unrelated. And I asked him about this. And I said, well, would you expect that those oxidation rates, the exogenous rates, would have been higher had made them work at a higher intensity, above that first lactate threshold?
Mm.
And he came back and said, well, the difficulty is that once you get above that first lactate threshold, as you get towards the second lactate threshold, is you actually start to see the percentage of the carbohydrate that you ingest that actually gets absorbed starts to become compromised. And that's probably because blood flow starts getting diverted away from the gut and towards the muscles to fuel all this activity and bring in enough oxygen, and also to the skin, because as you're putting out more and more watts, you're producing more body heat, and you've got to get rid of that. So you start to possibly be less effective at absorbing carbohydrate. And so in general, you don't see an increase in that exogenous oxidation by pushing the intensity higher. However, I guess the difference here is if you took a bunch of professional cyclists who, instead of, the males, what was it, 217 watts at that 95% of the first lactate threshold. Imagine you took a bunch of pro cyclists where that number was more like 300 watts. Then I suspect you would see a difference. So it's the same relative intensity. It's still 95% of the first lactate threshold, but the absolute intensity, the actual number of watts for that relative exercise intensity is greater. And I suspect then you'll find them going higher and higher. And that's pretty much what they saw when they did the analysis of the differences between the individuals in this study, is the things that predicted who would oxidize a greater percentage of that 90 grams an hour, or just the total grams per minute, was higher for the people who put out the most power at that intensity.
Which makes sense. And that's, I mean, it's sort of similar to that, the other study that we reviewed, isn't it? The IJAZ study, where the relative intensity was similar, and we saw, the rates of carbohydrate oxidation being, lower, but then when we actually looked at the absolute power being pushed out, that we'd probably see higher amounts, and that was irrespective of body weight, actually. So when
Yep.
and I know they did comment on that, and they looked at, was it body weight, and they also looked at height, didn't they, as predictors of
And power.
carbohydrate and power, and height as potential, what's the metrics. Metrics is the word I'm searching for determining perhaps carbohydrate oxidation. So, okay.
Yeah, and in that model, I mean, that model did explain some of the variance in there, but height and power, and particularly power, were the main predictors rather than weight. And the height, I suspect, is just that the taller male athletes were able to put out more power than the shorter female athletes. It's probably as simple as that.
Yeah, I'm sure if you actually then look into the height of the athlete, it probably does correspond to the gender, and what they were able to produce. So, no, it is interesting. And what else do we see in terms of the main outcomes? So, differences in obviously the amount of carbohydrate that the individuals were taking in, and then how did that translate?
Yeah. So when you look at the exogenous oxidation, so how much they were able to oxidize in both the trial where they were fed 90 grams an hour, and then the trial they were fed the personalized amount, which was in most cases quite a bit less than that. Actually, they were virtually identical. So 0.9 versus 0.91 grams per minute. So basically, as the title of the paper suggests, got a proof of concept. It is this proof of concept that if you feed people carbs to the level that they oxidize, or you overfeed them with carbs, you're not going to oxidize more, suggesting that the amount that you're shoving in isn't, in this case, the limiting factor here. Something else is the limiting factor. And so by personalizing that, you just reduce the amount of carbs that they actually have to consume to get the same oxidation numbers at the end of the day.
Which I guess translates in simple terms to cost. maybe you're not having to spend as much money on products that maybe you're not being used. But I guess, and look, we will get into that a little bit more, because I guess there's a lot of unanswered questions. Well, I'm sure a lot of athletes are like, well, hold on. How do I get this done? Can I get it done? If I can't get it done, how will I determine sort of my peak oxidation rate, and how much do I need? So I guess they're questions that are maybe unanswered or have been opened up by this study. If we do go into, or is there anything else you want to cover before I get into questions that maybe this study did answer in terms of the outcomes?
Yeah, I guess the other thing that they then looked at, a couple other things. One was gastrointestinal symptoms. So you had less gastrointestinal symptoms when you fed less carbohydrate. So kind of their point here was, well, if you overfeed all this carbohydrate that you can't actually use, it's not helping you, and it's just contributing to additional potential risk of gastrointestinal discomfort. So that was one of the points in there.
Can we just stop on that, Al, just for a sec? Because I think that's a really important one, isn't it? Because we talk about this at Fuel In a lot, like gut training, and people come to us with issues around gut training, and sometimes it's not necessarily a case of gut training, but actually looking at the amounts the individual's taking in, and we might not even have this fancy science of, isotope traces and things. But what we do look at is, okay, how much are you taking in on an hourly basis? And 120 grams. Okay. Back to one of the things that this study looked at was power output and height. Power output being a very key component to maybe estimating requirements. Well, what's your power output? 150 watts. Okay. Well, I don't think it's a case of gut training, is it? It's probably just a case of reducing amount. Again, what this study showed, that maybe it's just a case you're taking in too much carbohydrates based on what your needs are. And as this study showed, you reduce the carbohydrate amount that you're taking in, and suddenly your gut symptoms actually reduce. And that's not gut training. That's actually just a reduction in fuel intake or carbohydrate intake. And I thought that was a really interesting practical takeaway from this that hopefully resonates with a lot of athletes, that, yes, we see all the time these huge numbers. And again, we'll talk about maybe how this applies to the elite athlete, but maybe to the age grouper who's not at the level of, a 65 mil per kilogram VO2 max and things like that. Maybe simply reducing the amount of carbohydrates you're taking could be one of the keys to actually reducing GI symptoms.
Yeah, absolutely. Because, you're just putting in carbohydrate that you're not using.
Not using.
Yeah.
So,
it's an interesting point. We'll come back to it later, I think, because I asked him about this, whether he thought there was any kind of theoretical benefit to deliberately, or, taking in more carbohydrate than you can actually oxidize. And he had a couple of thoughts about that, which we'll come back to.
Yeah.
The other thing I want to say here is that they did measure some other things in this study. They measured perceived effort, RPE. That was actually lower in the personalized trial compared to the 90, and so was heart rate. It's not really clear why these things were lower or why they should be lower. They're working at the same power output. There's no differences in hydration or anything like that. It's not really clear why these findings are there, and I don't think this study really goes any way to explaining what that is, other than an interesting observation that might require some investigation in the future.
I guess we were saying, is it potentially possible that because they were just taking in more, they feel fuller, and that adds a level of stress, and that might contribute to this rate of perceived exertion, and
possibly
somewhere along the line.
Yeah.
We don't know. As you say, we don't know. We don't know at this point.
And then the final thing, I guess, we talked about the exogenous carbohydrate oxidation, but what about the rest of the contribution. So the endogenous carbohydrate, the glycogen that's being used, and then the fat oxidation, because remember, fat's still being used as a fuel here. And those were essentially no different between the two trials. So by dropping the carb intake to what they could theoretically exogenously oxidize, it didn't really change any of those other parameters either. There have been other studies where I guess they've pushed the carbs even higher. And yes, you can push exogenous oxidation higher, particularly in very high level athletes. And it usually comes actually at the expense of the endogenous carbohydrate, not at the expense of fat. In other words, you just use more carbs across the board and less fat, rather than same amount of fat and spare the glycogen. So actually adding more carbs in with your drinks and gels during exercise. And I spoke to Tim about this on the weekend. He said it's pretty clear now from the research that it doesn't actually spare glycogen in the way that people have kind of been hoping that it might from a sort of a holy grail perspective. So we tried, going super high fat, low carb for a while, and then reintroducing carbs at the last minute. That didn't work. And now we've gone from just shoveling in heaps of carbs during exercise to try and spare glycogen. That didn't work either.
And on the flip side, it also doesn't impact fat oxidation, which I think is fascinating as well, isn't it? Like a lot of people might claim, oh, you're not taking in as much carbs, so that's going to improve fat oxidation. Actually, didn't have an effect at all. So I guess it then comes down to how much carbs do you need? That's really the deciding factor here, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And that being based mostly on the absolute power output, not the relative power output.
Correct, which we've talked about many times, that athletes need to look at their absolute power output, and you don't have access to all this fancy stuff. That's a great starting point to at least start to, guesstimate or estimate your requirements.
And if we think about running just as a bit of a contrast to that, where you don't have power meters, it's basically the energy expenditure, which is the combination of pace multiplied by body weight. So this is where body weight will have a particularly large factor, is actually in running, because the energy cost of running is proportional to your body weight, because you've physically got to move that weight across the ground.
Yeah, completely. So what did this study answer? Like, can a lower personalized glucose intake match exogenous oxidation levels of a high standard intake? Is that?
Yes, it can. Yes, it can. I guess the question is, what does that matter? Because, trophies are not handed out on the person with the highest exogenous carbohydrate oxidation. And so, there's a difference between, just increasing oxidation for the sake of it. And we'll talk maybe about how or can you increase that oxidation level if yours is particularly low, versus performance, because they're not the same thing.
Yeah. I guess as an adjunct to that question, with the lower personalized amounts, we did see reduced RPE and, some of those GI symptoms. So I guess that potentially does relate to the podium. And the performance, which, there wasn't a performance element to this study, but, you could say, okay, well, if they're working, the same power output, but perceived to be working not as hard, and also they got less GI complaints, then that's going to be a positive to the athlete.
Correct.
Yep. Okay. Is there significant, I guess one question it did answer, is there significant individual variability in oxidation rates of exogenous oxidation rates?
Yeah, definitely. That was very clear, from as low as sort of 42 grams an hour up to as high as about 66 grams an hour. Remembering that that's the glucose only component. It doesn't include the fructose. Yep. And the literature we have to date suggests that the variability with fructose is probably even greater.
Yeah. Okay. And that's looking, and again, just so everyone hears those numbers, 42 to 66. And again, I'm wondering, well, why did they overfeed? Remember what Alan said, that the amount that you oxidize is not 1-to-1. It's not 100%. So that's why they'll tend to overfeed that by about 20%. And I think, okay, so I guess the question we've already answered, which it did answer, can personalization potentially reduce the risk of GI distress without reducing oxidation efficiency?
Correct. And as you
Yeah.
said, we don't have performance data from this to see whether performance was either compromised from having less carbs or was improved from having less GI symptoms. You could make an argument that theoretically it could go either way, but until you measure it, you can't say with confidence either way.
Yeah. So, and I mean, based on that, and you touched on it before, and you've had some email correspondence with Tim Podlicker, who was the lead author on this, and we're talking about this potential advantage, carbs above the rate of oxidation. And do you want to just, I know you touched on it before, but just really go over that again, because I think it's a really important point just to hammer home.
Yeah. So this, I guess, has particularly come forth because we're seeing these higher and higher and higher and higher carb intakes, particularly at the elite level in cycling and triathlon, even in ultra running now. You're having guys, knocking back 150 grams an hour in ultra trail running. In cycling, you're seeing guys 150 plus grams an hour of carbohydrate. The talk for Cam Worth recently was at Ironman Texas, I think the other week, was 200 grams an hour on the bike.
Yeah.
And as Tim said, there is no evidence that someone can actually oxidize, exogenously oxidize 200 grams an hour of carbohydrate, glucose, fructose combination. No one's ever seen it in the literature. That's not to say it can't happen, but from a scientific point of view, it's doubtful that it can happen. So then the question is, why feed all these extra carbs if you can't turn them into fuel? Yep. So Tim said, well, there's 3 hypothetical reasons that you could put forward that might explain this, but none of these have actually been studied. So these are all hypotheses at this stage. The first one is that for longer events, glycogen will become depleted within a few hours, regardless of what you're doing, unless it's, super low intensity. Yeah. So, it might be saying, well, okay, we can't spare that glycogen. It actually, if anything, it uses it up more quickly by feeding extra carbs, but it's still worth it in the long run towards the end of that event by having all this extra carbs in there. The other reason he suggested was that, particularly, I guess, in more undulating courses where you've got descents and things on a bike, for example, where the pace backs off, or in road cycling where you're in a peloton and you've got time where you're recovering, you're out of the wind and not pushing that much power, that you might actually get some glycogen being resynthesized during that time, so you could actually restore some of that glycogen by overfeeding carbohydrate during those downtimes where you don't have the demand for calories at that time. Again, these are all hypothetical. And then the final one he suggested, and I think this goes a long way to some of the anecdotal reports we get from people that are having these really high carb intakes. And one of the things I often say is, it's not so much the performance during the session, it's the recovery that I feel is so much better when I do this. And that was the other reason that Tim gave, is saying, well, if you have all these extra carbs going into the system, particularly in that last hour or two of exercise, if it's a long training session, it may actually more so be that it then provides an immediate source of carbohydrate to restore that glycogen very quickly after the training session finishes, and then actually improves that recovery by restoring the glycogen as quickly as possible. So it's not necessarily having to contribute to the exercise session itself, but it's immediately available as soon as the session finishes. So again, they're 3 hypothetical scenarios. They're nothing that's definite. They need to be studied. But they may give some reason of anecdotally why people are pushing these higher and higher levels of carb intake, despite no evidence that that'll actually get turned into fuel.
Yeah, I read point number 2 or listen to point number 2 and 3, and for me, they're the 2 that hypothetically, and I know we've discussed this, it's like, well, okay, Cam Worth taking in 200 grams an hour, he's not getting sick. He's feeling pretty good. So it's doing something. Like, okay, he's not oxidizing, but where's it going? And is there some sort of resynthesis occurring maybe in a down period? Or, it's got to be doing something. If he's not throwing it up or it's not coming out the bottom, then it's going somewhere, and it's going somewhere that's not causing issues, and he's having a great race and pushing out, a record on the bike course. So I'm sort of like, okay, so point number 2 makes sense to me. Hypothetically. And then I think point number 3 makes complete sense. Okay, you haven't used it all. It's not like, and we always say this as well, don't we? Like, it's not like exercise stops and your body goes, oh, okay, I know when I stopped exercising. Yes, okay, from, the way in which your body's actually working, but you've still got the carbs on board. So those carbs are going to go, okay, well, I'm not being used in the exercise component now. They have to be you know, theoretically shuttled into recovery mode. And so from, if we're looking at dietetic recommendations of the amount of carbohydrates that are required to consume to resynthesize glycogen as quickly as possible, well, if you've had excess, it just makes that process a little bit easier. And maybe it does allow you not to eat as much carbohydrates post-exercise and still get that glycogen resynthesis. So, look, I think what he's saying there is 100%. Like, I certainly lean into points 2 and 3 hard with why high carbohydrate intake for those particular types of athletes when they are doing it. And I think that's the important point here, isn't it? Like, it's the level of athlete is commensurate to their power output as well. We're not saying to everyone go and try and do 200 grams of carbs. We're seeing it in these elite athletes, but their power numbers are, they're just extreme.
Yep.
And so, they're doing something. And that's the point, isn't it? We haven't studied these types of athletes. And that's one of those, what questions does this open up? Which I guess is one of the questions, can these findings of this study be extrapolated to real world performance improvements? Where do we sit on that? And what did Tim say when you talked to him about it?
Yeah, well, like we said before, and when I spoke to Tim about it, he basically said, well, the question shouldn't be how much carbs can we oxidize, and I mean that might be in the context of gut training as well, because if we gut train, we can better tolerate the carbohydrate. We can get up to 200 grams an hour into the body. But as you said, it doesn't, and maybe for some people it will increase the amount they oxidize. That study's never been done. Tim's keen to do it, but he hasn't had the funding for it. But even if that was the case, if we could improve how much exogenous carbohydrate we oxidize, do we actually benefit from that? Is there an improvement to performance? And as he said, particularly at that elite level where people are probably maxed out all of those adaptations, the answer is probably no. Yes, you can absorb it from the gut, but just because it gets into the bloodstream doesn't guarantee it's going to be oxidized. Like there's multiple parts here, and traditionally we always thought the gut was the only bottleneck, but perhaps particularly at the elite level and with gut training now, it's not the only bottleneck. Part of it is just the demand for calories, how much power you're pushing. And so, he mentioned, you don't find any glycogen sparing when you consume all of these extra carbs. Like they did 120 grams an hour versus a 90 grams an hour study. And yes, you could increase exogenous oxidation in high-level athletes by feeding them more, but they used up the glycogen just as quickly. And so is it actually beneficial from that perspective? Possibly not.
Yeah. That's super interesting. And I think, do we need to, I know we talked about, the importance of power. If someone doesn't have access to this type of testing, and you can elaborate again on that maybe this testing will become available, although it's going to be pretty expensive by the sounds of things. Like, where does power fit into this in your perspective? Like, how could someone look at this study and go, okay, I take in 90 grams an hour at the moment. Do I need to? How could they use their existing information, say on Training Peaks, Tridot, whatnot? It's feeding into Fuel In, and they're saying, I'm doing my carb testing, I'm doing my carb capacity testing, and I feel pretty full a lot of the time. And I just, I'm getting some GI complaints. How could they use their power meter to sort of say, maybe I'm doing, too much carb intake?
Yeah, it's a good question. I might start off with the testing first, just before I forget it. So you mentioned then that the testing. So I know Tim and Gareth Wallace, who was one of the other authors on this study, are planning on opening up the ability to people to actually go and have this tested, the exogenous oxidation. It'll be in 2 universities in the UK, so the University of Exeter and the University of Birmingham. And then I think they're partnering with a university in Germany to do the same thing. But this is not a cheap test. They're talking like over 1,000 British pounds for the testing. So, depending on, I guess, your income and how much you're invested in the sport, that may be considered value for money. It may be completely out of reach. It depends, of course, on the individual and their scenario. But in terms of how you can use power output to do this, it is a little bit tricky in terms of working out exactly, and there's a bit of art and a bit of science to this. This is something that we've spent a lot of time sort of modeling out for fuel in with the new algorithm that we're putting together at the moment, where the carbohydrate recommendations will adjust to people's power output. So by entering your FTP, we can sort of work out then the power in different zones. So if you're doing a zone 2 session or a zone 3 session or whatever it is, we can estimate the carbohydrate use from those sessions. There have been a couple of other models published recently as well, using things like TSS to predict carbohydrate needs. But it's a pretty tricky one. It's not like I can just give you one number here and go, just do this and you'll know exactly what your carbohydrate needs are. It's definitely nowhere near that simple. And that's to look at the total carbohydrate needs. So then from there, you've got to work backwards and say, well, how much of that can we theoretically get from glycogen versus how much do we need to actually consume on the bike or during our run or whatever it is, to make up the difference. And so it is a little bit of art as well as science still at the moment. There's no easy way to do this. But I guess what we're saying is that the higher your power output at any given relative intensity, so I guess if you think about your power output at VO2 max or your power output at FTP or your running pace at your threshold running pace or swim speed, and for running, you've got to consider body weight in there as well. Those sort of things are the things that are going to influence the total amount of calories you actually need to produce, the total amount of energy you need to expend to maintain that pace or power output in whatever discipline. And carbohydrate will obviously be a major contributor to that.
Yeah, no, I think it's, as you said, there is an art to it as well. As much as people want definitive answers, there's always going to be, well, we need you to trial. We need you to test how much you're taking in. And that's exactly, I guess, what we're trying to do with the system we've set up is, okay, document what you're taking in, how you feel, any GI complaints, your, how the session went, and then, did you execute it, and then adjusting those intakes according to how you're feeling as much as like the numbers in your power meter and whatnot. So I think it is trial and error, and repeated testing is important.
Yeah, and I think like we can come up with the theoretical, how much carbohydrate should you need, and if you get less than that at the moment and you have GI symptoms, well, have we overestimated how much you need and you're essentially telling you to overfeed carbohydrate, or is it just that you can't tolerate the amount that you theoretically need and performance is being limited by your gut's ability to digest, absorb, and tolerate those carbohydrates, or the volume of food and fluids you need to get those carbs in. And so it can work a little bit in both ways. But I think that's kind of the approach that we're taking moving forward with fueling, is to say, well, theoretically, this is how much we think you should need. If you're not able to tolerate that amount now, then you can work your way up to that from a gut training perspective. And that's where the carb tolerance test within the app is so useful for people, is to sort of track where they're at, how they're feeling with that, and then compare that to where theoretically we think they need to get to.
And I think that
from a performance point of view.
Yeah, I think that's a great way of thinking about it. Like if we're estimating this is theoretically the amount you should be taking in, and as you say, you're taking in less than that, but you're getting GI complaint. Okay, maybe the gut training component is going to be, very important to you. But if it's, you are taking in that amount based on the estimated, or you're taking it above, then maybe just dropping down. That could be. Then you're looking at it from both sides of the equation, I guess, which probably brings me to like the role of gut training and habitual diet in influencing exogenous carbohydrate oxidation and the variability in that. Do you want to touch on that? And again, what the discussions you had with Tim regarding his sort of hypothesis on that, and also I think your insights into that are pretty important now, considering you've been involved in some of those studies down in Monash.
Yeah, so I mean, one of the talking points with gut training is improving the ability to utilize carbohydrates. So I guess if we go back in time, probably 10 or 15 years, it was kind of just assumed that the gut was the bottleneck in that whole process of getting carbohydrate from your mouth to your muscles and then being used as fuel. And so it was sort of like, well, if we can improve the absorption of carbohydrate, it's going to lead to more carbohydrate getting to the muscle. Therefore, we can use more carbohydrate in the muscle, which is that exogenous oxidation. There have been no studies on that. So there are very few actually gut training studies out there in the literature. People will be shocked at how little research there actually is compared to the amount of talk there is about gut training. That said, there are some studies that suggest, overfeeding carbohydrate again, deliberately overfeeding for a period of time, you can result in reduced GI symptoms, a better tolerance, and less evidence of malabsorption, suggesting that it is actually getting absorbed, but it's an assumption. It's not guaranteed because it's not being tracked with isotopes or anything. And it's not, the oxidation hasn't been measured itself, only the total carb oxidation, which is unchanged, which is what you expect from this study as well. So there are no studies currently measuring exogenous oxidation, and if we gut train someone for a while, can they improve their exogenous oxidation? As I said before, Tim said he would love to do the study. He can't find anyone to fund it at the moment, unfortunately. But one thing he said to me is that he's not convinced actually that gut training will improve exogenous oxidation, particularly of glucose as opposed to fructose. And the reason is that most people, athletes that are doing serious endurance training, they're eating a lot of carbohydrate on a day-to-day basis anyway. So, the ability to digest and absorb carbohydrate, well, you could train that during exercise, but it's probably being trained just from eating lots of carbohydrate when you're not exercising, because that process of digesting and absorbing carbohydrate is not exercise specific. And so his thought is that particularly for the glucose, which is what you get from your pastas and rices and all your starchy foods, as well as obviously glucose in drinks and gels and things, that people are probably, as long as you're eating a relatively high carbohydrate intake because you're doing lots of training, you're probably kind of maxed out on those adaptations already. You don't need to train them additionally. Fructose might be a different story depending on your background level of fructose intake. Probably depends on what products you train with, but also other sort of fructose containing foods you eat in your diet on a day-to-day basis, so honey and certain types of fruit and just general sugar, which is half glucose, half fructose as well. But yeah, he's certainly saying it's far from certain that gut training will improve the exogenous oxidation rate, because that might not be the bottleneck after all. But where gut training is particularly successful, both in the lab and anecdotally in the real world, is the tolerance just to the volume of food and fluids required to get through the system, to get that carbohydrate to the blood in the first place.
So I guess the question I've got, Tim obviously deals a lot with high level athletes. And I think the caveat to what he's saying is that it may not make a difference to exogenous. And again, this is what I'd like clarified is, would it make, if those elite athletes, as you said, are consuming lots of carbs in their daily diet, maybe we won't see a change there, and that's where gut training won't change anything. I guess the flip side to that is what we see a lot in Fill In. These athletes coming in who are either carb phobic, have been told carbs are bad, they wonder why they've got gut issues. They start to follow a plan which is periodized carbohydrates around their training needs. I wonder, those athletes who typically habitually have not been taking in a lot of carbohydrates, we start to change that. Does that change that particular population's ability to oxidize these exogenous carbohydrates, because they're not like that elite athlete that Tim is referring to? And I think, again, that's where I think this gets all very gray and murky, is like, okay, now we're talking about specific populations. And I hypothesize or theorize that I think that group that I just described there, I think they would see changes in exogenous carbohydrate oxidation versus you're talking about, the elite athlete who maybe consumes 5 to 10 grams of carbs on typical days and is consuming huge amounts during training and all that. So I think that would be interesting to study.
Yeah. The way I like to think about it, because as I said before, traditionally we've thought that the gut is the main or the only bottleneck in some cases of that whole process from mouth to muscle. But the way I see it is probably that there's two elements. There's a push element and a pull element. The push element is getting the carbohydrate absorbed from the gut in the first place. And the pull element is actually the work that the muscle's doing in terms of its demand for carbohydrate because of the power output that's being produced. And so for elite athletes, if you had an elite athlete, you can have enormous pull They may not have much push if they haven't consumed much carbohydrate in the past. And I think that's the change that we've seen over the last sort of 5 to 10 years as gut training's become a thing in elite athletes, is you've got the push there and the pull was always there in the background. Whereas, as you said, with age groupers, beginners, smaller people who traditionally eat much lower amounts of carbohydrate per day, but also probably have lower FTPs, lower power outputs, running pace, etc. They probably have less of the push and the pull. And so the question is, well, which one do they need to train to get that system improved? Well, the answer is probably both. As you said, like if you only eat 150 grams of carbs a day, it's unlikely that you're going to be optimally trained to consume 100 and something grams an hour during exercise. So you probably need to train the push element, that's the gut training, but also with exercise training, as you improve and you get fitter, you're going to improve the pull element to that as well. And so I think, working on both, but I definitely think that the gut training, you may see an improvement, definitely on the push side. But whether you need the pull to come along with it to translate it into exogenous oxidation is hard to say until someone studies it.
I love that analogy, and I imagine the pull is impacted by the push as well, because if you're under fueling with carbs, you're trying to really,
the training.
As I bloody saw with the keto diet, like you just can't do that training because it becomes incredibly difficult. So then the pull element is not being actually sufficient, so you can't improve. So yeah, I think and that's where it's not like, okay, you go from 0 to 120. It's staged, and you have to build that up gradually, hence the term gut training. But that training is also applicable to your own training, where, you're not going to push 400 watts all the time when you first start out. You may never do that. But, you've got to build up, like everything, like, lifting weights, training on the bike, running. It's just a process of building up and improving over time. And I love that analogy of, both ends. Push and pull. And I think having an athlete thinking about those two elements is probably a really smart description of how they can impact this from both elements, like the training and the nutrition. So yeah, I love that.
Yeah. And the fact that you don't want them out of sync. Like we talked about before, you can have someone trying to get in 90 grams an hour, and because they've practiced it, they can do it. So they've trained the push, but they don't have the pull.
Yeah. No, I mean, we've always said nutrition and training go hand in hand. You can't expect one to necessarily improve without the other. I think they are very symbiotic in the way. And when you get the two of them in combination with potentially your recovery elements like sleep, you start to see real improvement across the board for that athlete. I think we've covered pretty much everything in the study. I know the 20 minutes, the 30-minute overview obviously went over, but that's all right. I think we covered so much that this study sort of opened up, but also from our insights or our experience, what we're seeing and what athletes, how they can use this information to hopefully get a better understanding of what they're doing. And look, again, we may have opened up more questions to athletes than now. And now they're thinking, oh, okay, well, how do I apply this to myself? So look, we're, if you've got questions as a result of this study and what we've talked about, obviously feel free to share them with us. support@fueln.com. You can send those through, or to coach@fueln.com, and we can have a look at those questions and maybe answer it in a future episode. Is there anything else, anything else from the study that you would have liked to have seen, or potentially Tim's mentioned that they're looking at for future? Maybe just even the fructose glucose question. Do you think that's going to be tackled in the future? Because, if we think of, I guess that's the real world implication of this, isn't it? Like not many people are consuming 90 grams of glucose in a race. Most of the products contain glucose and fructose either in a 2-to-1 or a 1-to-0.8 ratio. Do you think the future of this testing, maybe in a study format, is to actually use real world products and look at what's happening with these athletes?
Yeah, I mean, obviously you need the stable isotope traces, so that always makes it a bit difficult from a study design point of view. But you're right. I think, looking at the glucose and fructose together is important. Looking at the impact that gut training may or may not have on that is going to be important as well. And as we said, like, not assuming that that what goes on with elite athletes is the same as what goes on with your high level age groupers, which is not the same as what goes on with your complete beginners, because they're completely different groups of athletes. Using that push-pull analogy, they've got different levels of push and different levels of pull. And so which one needs training more? Do they need training together or in sequence? There's still a lot more to go on there to be answered, I think. But, I think it starts to point us in some direction, some interesting directions, which is nice.
For sure. I'll be fascinated to learn when someone does go and get this testing done with Tim or the team down in Exeter. It'd be great to hear what the experience was and what they found from it. So if someone does do that, feel free to share the information. Al, as always, insightful. I always learn a lot talking to you, and hopefully the listeners did as well. Hopefully we didn't confuse too many people babbling on about exogenous oxidation rates and whatnot. But look, it's a great study. I think it's a great starting point, as you said. And, despite all the talk of high carbohydrate intake, gut training, everything, there's just still, a general lack of hard science in the area. And, I think so much more is going to come over these coming years with regards to sort of, talking about population-specific data and what we can sort of extrapolate from that to make decision-making better for athletes. So, but in the meantime, look, you do it the way you described, I think. We can predict based on power numbers. We can then get the athlete testing, retesting, monitoring performance from performance metrics and power output and all that, but also subjectively how the athlete's feeling. And that in itself is super important. How you feel is probably going to have a big impact on how you finish the race or not. So,
All good.
Perfect. Thanks, mate. I'll chat to you soon.
Will do. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.